200,000 miles from Earth, an explosion ripped a panel clean off the spacecraft, and 3 men found themselves drifting through the dark in a ship that was bleeding oxygen, losing power and slowly freezing. No rescue ship, no backup, no way for help to reach them in time. This wasn't a movie. This was 1970, and the only reason you've ever heard the name Apollo 13 is because, against odds, that should have killed all 3 of them. They made it home. The mission was supposed to be routine. Apollo 13 launched on April 11th, 1970, the 3rd attempt to land humans on the moon. Commander Jim Lovell, Command Module Pilot Jack Swigert, and Lunar Module Pilot Fred Haise were headed for the Fra Mauro Highlands. Swigert wasn't even meant to be on this flight. A last-minute replacement after the original pilot, Ken Mattingly, was exposed to German measles days before launch. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Just one more small ordinary detail in a mission about to become anything but. For the first 2 days, everything went almost perfectly. So smoothly, in fact, that less than an hour before the explosion, the capsule communicator on duty radioed up that the spacecraft looked great and joked that everyone in mission control was bored to tears. It was the last time anyone would say the word bored for a very long time. Then at 55 hours and 54 minutes into the mission control asked the crew to do something they'd done a dozen times before: stir the cryogenic oxygen tanks, a routine procedure to keep the readings accurate. 16 seconds after Swigert flipped the switch, the spacecraft was rocked by a bang. The crew said they felt through the entire vehicle. Lovell radioed back the line that would define the mission. "Houston, we've had a problem." What had actually happened was a chain of small separate failures from years earlier, finally converging at the worst possible moment. In the worst possible place. In 1965, the oxygen tank's internal heaters were upgraded to run on a higher voltage, but the thermostatic switches meant to protect those heaters were never upgraded to match. Then in 1968, that same tank, oxygen tank number 2, was jolted during removal from another Apollo spacecraft, dropped about 2 inches. No damage was detected, and it was quietly installed in Apollo 13 anyway. Weeks before launch, during a routine ground test, that same tank wouldn't drain properly, almost certainly because of that earlier drop. The workaround was to run its internal heaters for about 8 hours straight to boil the oxygen off, at temperatures around 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. The mismatched switches couldn't shut the heaters off in time, and the heat silently destroyed the wiring insulation inside the tank, leaving bare wires sitting in pure pressurized oxygen, a small bomb quietly built and armed on the ground, sealed inside the spacecraft, and launched into space without anyone on Earth knowing it was there. 200,000 miles from home, those wires were finally sparked. The tank didn't just leak, it violently ruptured, blowing an entire panel off the service module and damaging the tank beside it too. Within minutes, the spacecraft was venting its main oxygen supply into the vacuum, and with it, the power generated by the fuel cells, keeping the whole ship alive. This is the moment the mission stopped being about the moon and became a fight to simply stay alive. The command module, Odyssey, was dying, its main power gone, its remaining batteries reserved for the final hours of re-entry and draining with every minute that passed. If the crew stayed inside it, they would run out of power long before Earth was anywhere in reach. So Mission Control turned to a plan that had existed only on paper for years, a theoretical idea nobody had ever rehearsed, let alone flown. Power up the lunar module, Aquarius, and turn it into a lifeboat. Here's the problem. Aquarius was designed to keep 2 astronauts alive on the lunar surface for about 45 hours. It now had to keep 3 astronauts alive for the journey back to Earth, a trip that would take roughly 4 times as long. Every system on board was suddenly being asked to do a job it was never built for. The first crisis was navigation, and it came down to a margin of error measured in fractions of a degree. To bend their trajectory back towards Earth, the crew had to fire the lunar module's descent engine without their normal guidance computer. Running it would burn power they couldn't spare. Instead, Lovell manually aligned the entire spacecraft using the sun as the only reference point, by eye through a tiny window, while the ship slowly drifted off course from gas hissing out of the wreckage. Get that alignment wrong by even a hair, and Apollo 13 wouldn't loop the moon and come home. It would sail past Earth entirely, out into the dark, with nothing waiting at the other end. Then came the cold, with almost every non-essential system shut down, including the heaters. The temperature inside sank to around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. Moisture crept across every wall, every window, every panel, beating in the weightless dark. Real sleep became almost impossible, and because the same water also cooled the spacecraft's electronics, Lovell rationed the crew to 6 ounces each per day, about a fifth of what a person needs. By splashdown, the 3 of them had lost a combined total of over 30 pounds. Lovell alone lost 14. Haise, dehydrated and weakening, developing a serious urinary tract infection that left him shaking with chills and fever for the final days. 200,000 miles from the nearest doctor. And then there was the air itself, turning slowly toxic with every breath. With 3 men in a cabin built for 2, carbon dioxide climbed toward dangerous levels. The lunar module's scrubbers used square canisters, and they were running out. The command module had plenty of spares, but they were round. They simply did not fit. If nobody found a way to force a square filter into a round socket, the crew would slowly poison themselves on their own exhaled breath, fully conscious, watching the numbers climb with nothing to do but wait. On the ground, engineers spent 2 days straight building a fix out of whatever the crew had on hand. A plastic bag, a saw, cardboard torn from a flight manual cover, and roll after roll of duct tape. The instructions were read up piece by piece. The crew built it, taped it into place, and the carbon dioxide levels began gradually falling back into the safe zone. But surviving the journey home solved only half the problem. Earth's atmosphere itself was the final trap. With almost no margin for air, coming too steep, and the deceleration forces and heat would tear the capsule apart with the crew still inside. Coming too shallow, and the spacecraft wouldn't be caught by the atmosphere at all. It would skip off the top of it like a stone off water, flung back out into space on a trajectory with no way to ever turn around. The safe window was a band only a few degrees wide, and the entire way home, something was quietly pushing them off that line. Water vapor venting from the lunar module's own cooling system, the very system keeping its electronics alive, acting like a tiny continuous thruster nobody had accounted for. Ground trackers kept catching the drift and radioing up correction after correction, and the crew had to fly multiple unplanned manual burns just to claw their way back onto that razor-thin corridor. On April 17, 1970, the crew jettisoned the wrecked service module and finally saw exactly what had nearly killed them. An entire panel was simply gone, wiring and insulation hanging out into the vacuum, torn metal catching the sunlight. Lovell stared at it and said flatly, "There's one whole side of that spacecraft missing." Minutes later, they powered up Odyssey, a command module that had been sitting dark, cold, and dripping with condensation for days, fully aware a single short circuit in any of that soaked wiring could end everything in an instant. Nobody had ever revived a command module from a 4-day cold shutdown before. The procedure didn't exist. Flight corridors wrote it from nothing, a job that should have taken months in 3 days. Re-entry brings its own automatic blackout, a stretch where heat and ionized air swallow every radio signal, normally lasting around 3 minutes, predictable almost to the second on every Apollo flight before this one. Mission Control watched the clock. The window came. The window passed. The silence kept going, nearly a minute and a half longer than it should have. The direct result of that shallower trajectory, nobody in Mission Control spoke. Nobody moved. For those extra seconds, there was no way to know whether Apollo 13 had come through, skipped off into a trajectory with no return, or torn itself apart on a heat shield nobody on Earth had been able to inspect. Then the silence broke. The capsule was down. Parachutes open, drifting into the South Pacific, splashing down within 4 miles of the recovery ship, almost dead on target. Mission elapsed time 142 hours and 54 minutes. Apollo 13 never landed on the moon, but its own goal, it was a failure. But it became one of the most watched events in television history to that point. Tens of millions worldwide tuned in for the splashdown, on a mission NASA had originally struggled to get any network interested in broadcasting, because a moon landing had started to feel routine. The crew received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. So did the entire mission operations team in Houston, because surviving wasn't luck. It was a handful of engineers on the ground and 3 exhausted, freezing, slowly positioning men in space, refusing to let a single point of failure be the last word. Every single one of those fixes had to work. The navigation, the power, the air, the cold, the re-entry angle, not most of them, all of them, in order, with no second attempts and no way to know in advance which one would fail next. For a few days in April of 1970, the entire world held its breath, waiting to find out if it would. If you guys want to learn more about the harsh realities of space, the harsh realities of exploration, the disasters that have occurred, and the eeriness of everything in space, be sure to subscribe.